box has a brand new pack of cards. Let's see what's inside.
Welcome back, everybody. We've got, of course, another pack opening. Today we are going to be doing Music of Dragons. So without any further ado, and the Starks are starting us off strong with Meera Reed. This card is so good that it actually got redesigned. So first, let's take a look at its original stats real quick and see maybe why it did. It's 2 printed cost, 1 shadow cost, so 3 total. It has stealth. It has the amazing lady trait, which is super supported by Tyrells and in general allows her to fetch bigger lords and ladies with heir to the Iron Throne, the plot card. And its ability is you can return it to shadows anytime a Stark character you control is sacrificed, and then when you bring it out of shadows, which costs 1 gold once it's in it, then you can basically start accept something. You can get rid of its printed text. This is really good. I'm not super familiar with the Starks, but what the redesign basically did is change the condition to when a winter plot card is revealed and change her shadow cost to 2. The shadow cost 1 is really kind of busted on this. I mean, on paper, she already has 2 icons, stealth, and an amazing trait, lady. So she's already good before we even look at her ability. But the ability to pay 1 gold in general to bring her out of shadows to negate something, even if she couldn't put herself back into shadows, that would be non-trivial. A card that for essentially 3 cost and is a body on the board, surprise nightmares something. It does have to be a character, but whatever. The reason I assume that they changed that cost, is because it's just too cheap. I mean, you could just keep doing it over and over again. But what I really assume that they had to nerf here was a star character you control being sacrificed. It is an easy trigger condition to meet, but I think the main problem is you can do it several times per turn. Even if you build an entire winter plot deck, you can only do that on the eroded version once per turn. I think basically what they were trying to do is nerf her a little bit, but keep her about the same by preventing you from using her ability more than once per turn, which would be a really unpleasant source of negates against your opponent, and make her a little bit more expensive to do every turn. Like if you want to have that negate set every turn, you need to have put 2 gold aside for that, even if she is going back into shadows every turn. So she's still a really good card, but the version of her before is interesting in that when they eroded her, they actually changed 2 different things, and they normally try to touch as very little as possible. So I don't know much about the Starks, but I know this card's good because they had to change it. Unless they changed it because it was so bad. But I don't think that's what happened. Next up for the Starks is the attachment version of Shaggy Dog. 3 cost attachment, pretty bulky, but considering that it's a freaking wolf, that makes sense. It's actually more expensive than the character version. The character version of Shaggy Dog is pretty bad. It's, I think, 2 cost just as a military icon, and then if you have Rickon, who's an amazing card, but not necessarily for his strength, he gets +2 strength and a military icon. What you can do that's a sick combo that I actually learned from a comment on one of my previous videos is you can use the Stark card Skagos, since even though they're different card types, this is an attachment and that version is a character, you could sacrifice the character to put the attachment into play. And this in particular would be really good to put into play in the middle of the challenges phase because you can use it to make your opponent kill something. It basically forces your opponent to resolve military claim. That, especially after a board wipe, that can be really good. And it has this thing that I've noticed a lot of the direwolves have, seem to be like a unique Stark thing, is you can pay 1 gold to attach Shaggy Dog to someone else. That's an action, so you can do that in the middle of the challenges phase. You also don't have a condition on how many times you can actually use the first ability of Shaggy Dog. So if you win a challenge with something, your opponent kills something, and then you pay a gold to put this on something else, you can make them kill something again. A lot of ways to fetch this out. I haven't made a direwolf deck, but what I find really unique about them is that they are the only real cards in the game other than like Old Bear's Raven that I can think of that have attachment versions and character versions that are both unique, so you have to sort of choose, but it also allows for some flexibility in duplicates and with cards like Skagos. So overall, this seems fun, and I would really like to make a Stark deck. I've been saying that for years. Maybe one day I will. Starting the Tyrells is a great card. It's Sir Mark Mullendore. Charming artwork of him with a monkey. I actually managed to read through the entire series several times, but until I saw this card's art, I didn't know that this guy had a monkey. And sadly, it's implied by the appendix of, I think, Clash of Kings that the monkey did die in the Battle of Blackwater. I really think we should see that monkey as an attachment, but as of right now, I'm satisfied seeing it on Mark. Mark is a knight. He's a 4-cost knight with an intrigue icon, which is probably the rarest icon amongst knights. And Tyrells have a lot of supports for knights in general, and they have a good amount of them. But he also supports something different about the Tyrells Tyrell strategy, which is information about the top of your deck. You can get that kind of information with cards like Bear and the Maiden Fair, and you can exploit that kind of information with cards like Old Town. He's kind of a combination of both of them. After he wins a challenge, you can put the top card of your deck into play, which is always going to be doable unless it's an event. Then if you do, you put him on the top of your deck. This can work on both ends of the top card of your deck information strategy. If you know what's at the top of your deck and it's a good card, or maybe an expensive card, you can use him to cheat him out. Like, that can save you some econ advantage, or you can use him to essentially ambush something that's not telegraphed maybe to your opponent, but it is to you. And then what happens is Mark goes on the top of your deck. Like, before, maybe you knew what the top of your deck was, but now you definitely do. You know it's Mark Mullendor, so you can trigger a bunch of stuff. I like what he does for the whole Old Town scrying top of your deck information style strategy, but his Knight trait would be better used elsewhere. Overall, though, decent card, kind of splashable filler. The next Tyrell card is just my favorite type of card, and that's a zero-cost event. I love zero-cost events because they're totally untelegraphed. This one is something that benefits from being untelegraphed, and it's kind of trolly. You basically attack with some knights, and then your opponent is like, okay, that's this much strength, I'll block with these things. Then you play this, Bonds of Chivalry, and then you kneel one of the knights you attacked with, and then you stand a different one, and now that's attacking. So it basically allows you to, after your opponent declares defenders, or before if you want to for some reason, switch one of your attackers with another one as long as they're both knights. Kind of funny, and it stands them. You can also use it in response to seeing that your opponent would win the challenge, where even if you're not going to necessarily win if you switch knights, one of the knights that you really wanted to win with, you can now stand so he can try a different challenge. So even if this isn't going to win you the challenge, standing one of the characters isn't necessarily a bad thing. I like it because it's a zero-cost event. You could run a Tyrell-focused deck, which would probably focus on a lot of strength buff events like Growing Strong to buff a lot of knights like the Knight of Flowers. And if you did do an event-focused deck, you would definitely be running the version of the Queen of Thorns that focuses on events because she is busted. And if you're going to be running an event deck in any faction and there's a zero-cost event, just put it in. Okay, that's not true. Put it in if you have a few knights, but if you're running Tyrell's, chances you will. Night's Watch starts off with our boy Jon Snow, and hot damn, has this got to be the coolest version of him. I mean, it's the Lord Commander version of him because he has the Commander and Lord traits, which are only shared otherwise by the Old Bear. And he's 7 costs, and just look at his cloak. Who are those people in the background? They're just like standing in awe. He's also, of course, still a bastard, so there's some support for him, mainly in Baratheons, but he self-supports. So his idea basically is that the Night's Watch faction has kind of segmented off each icon, challenge icon, into one of its traits. The Rangers have the military, the Stewards have the intrigue, and the Builders have the power. There are a couple cards like this. There's, I think, the Horn That Waits the Sleepers and West Watch by the Bridge that are benefited from not dedicating yourself to one of those, but rather trying to assemble them all. Jon is a good example of this, and the best part is that if you give Jon Snow Sworn to the Watch a zero-cost attachment, non-terminal, he won't become Night's Watch, obviously, because he already is, but he will then become a Ranger Builder and a Steward, and then gain Stealth, Intimidate, and Insight, all from one zero-cost attachment. That's hilarious. Now, without that self-combo, which is amazing, it's not too hard to have at least one of these. There's an amazing search event that's 3 costs, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend a 3-cost event under normal circumstances, but Fresh Recruits is fantastic because it lets you add one of each type to your hand. And Steward at the Wall, which is the basically in-faction 1-cost character that you kneel to reduce the cost of the next Night's Watch character you play by 1, is itself a Steward. So, like, no matter what you're running, just the Econ Foundation itself is probably going to have a Steward in it, so he's probably going to at least have Insight, which will help you draw into more Rangers and Builders. Ranger is, I would say, kind of the worst of the 3 in terms of synergy, which is probably why it gives him the best ability. But while I do enjoy Insight, Stealth, and Intimidate, I think are not only both better, but they combo well. However, it is a little boring that this version of Jon Snow doesn't have any abilities other than the ability to give himself keywords. I mean, it is savage. The combo is Sworn to the Watch, and it's also just savage to have. You need to be a little bit more strategic with what you pick on your military claim, because even if something's like 1 cost and it's not doing much for you other than being a builder, that's relevant because you want John to have stealth. So if you're playing a Night's Watch deck that is not wildling focused, because there is a version of Jon Snow for that, or like a Steward deck is, I guess, what the original Jon from the core set supports, this card is just so badass. I don't think, sadly, it's as good as it really should be, but it's just worth it to swear him to the watch. I mean, Jon Snow sworn to the watch, like, nothing can stop that. Once he swears his vows, you're finished. How appropriately, the next card for the Night's Watch is the 3-cost attachment, Lord Commander. I really like this attachment, and it's just another badass picture of Jon. This pack loves Jon, and you know what? So do I. Now, I just want to point out how this little cost of not being able to equip this to anything except Night's Watch characters printing cost 5 or higher is such a good bit of lore balancing. I mean, it just seems like a little bit of card balance, but it's so much more than that. That means the only things that you can equip this to are Jon, all 3 versions of him, all 2 versions of the Old Bear, Janos Slynt, who he did try, Alistair Thorne, who is also another contender, Bowen Marsh, Othel Yarwick, basically all the people who are in contention to be Lord Commander in the books, which I just think is so impressive, and I love how the game designs this. This card is good. It's good in an attachment deck, which you can definitely make using Trading with Cahor, Donal Noy, and Catapult on the Wall, because it can swap itself out into any other attachments. But it's also just good in a nutshell as a general win condition that you can splash in. You have an ace card, you're going to use it to win a lot of challenges. It's an accelerant up to technically, I guess, 6 times per turn, you can get a power on one of your big boys. And this is when any Night's Watch character wins a challenge, and they have some options to win on the defense. So you can get some surprise power from this. If you get this early on, this can be pretty good, but it's expensive, especially for an attachment that requires a Night's Watch character with printed cost 5 or higher. I mean, we're talking 8 gold right away. So I like this card. I'm not sure I would put in more than 1, though. It seems like once you've got your board ready and you draw into this as a way to just start getting power more and winning, it's good, but it can definitely brick early. Starting Baratheons is a new version of Shireen. We haven't seen one since the core set, and this one was released late enough to have the shadow mechanic. She's 3 cost with the same shadow cost or printed cost. Never really a good sign. That means she's +2 more total instead of +1 to play. And she is still a lady, so you can use Heir to the Iron Throne on her. She's still a cheap one. And she has this pretty cool ability where the first time you do it, let's say you take her out of shadow so your opponent doesn't expect it, they attack you, you bring her in, it'd have to be a power challenge, block with her, and then you can remove her strength and remove one of their other guys, like maybe their big guy, and then all of a sudden they lose the challenge and they look like a schmuck. This is going to be telegraphed from then on. You can still do it on the offense, but the problem is only with power challenges. Now, that's not really a problem, that's more like a design synergy. The Baratheons really like power challenges. Unfortunately, my heart belongs with the 2-cost Shireen from the core set, which is some of the best military fodder in the game and some of the best Heir to the Iron Throne starters in the game. I mean, she's a 2-cost sword who kneels something when she's killed. It makes your opponent very hesitant to do a military challenge, especially if you have kneel control, but you don't even need it. She is great in setup to air into something. She is a really good card. This one isn't that much less airable, but she tries to have a more proactive ability, and I just don't think it's necessary. I mean, she's kind of expensive to do that. Just please, make my opponent a little scared for some military challenges. Give me the air stuff. I don't need all this power challenge shenanigans. That's what I'm airing into. I don't need her help with that. Okay, here is something funny you could do with it. You could pick, of course, one of your own characters. The only thing I can think of that would really benefit from that is if you maybe forfeited on the offense and then you triggered, I don't know, fucking Hellholt. Maybe there's something else. Use it on your own character. This is a great Shireen. Okay, all sarcasm aside, time to get serious. This next card is busted. Privileged Position is a 1-cost event. Now, you know me, I love 0-cost events, but I will vouch for this one. The trigger condition is play only if you have not lost a power challenge this round, and it's basically just a negate, a treachery, if you will. It stops an opponent's event or triggered location ability. So it can't do jack against attachments and most importantly characters. So first of all, let's talk about that. That's great. Just a general negate. Actually, I think we're done talking about that. What we want to talk about with this card is the trigger condition. Now, let's go to an extreme example, and this would be difficult to even build, but let's say your deck doesn't even have any characters with power icons in them. There is no way you could ever win a power challenge. This card would still be good because it is guaranteed to go off at anything that happens in marshalling, right? Your opponent hasn't even had a chance to do a power challenge, nor have you. Challenges haven't begun, so you definitely haven't lost one, and it's not because you did anything special. Stops anything in marshalling for 1 cost. This can be immediately used on, let's say, some of your opponent's 2-cost econ locations like a Dornish Fiefdom, or maybe a neutral econ location like King's Road. Anything that would have to trigger itself that's not a passive gold modifier but gives you gold or reduces cost when you trigger it, this can stop, which is pretty hilarious. This card is also usable if you go first in the challenges phase, guaranteed, until after you've done a power challenge. Maybe you could do a power challenge and lose, and then you wouldn't be able to play this. But, if your opponent tried to win by using a triggered location ability, you could also play this, although that would kind of force you to play it. This is something you really have to worry about if you're playing against someone who's using Baratheons. They can be used so flexibly that, unlike a lot of negates that you kind of save in your hand that can be gotten rid of in an intrigue challenge or something, if you draw into a second privileged position, you're probably just going to use the first one to stifle their econ or something like that, something less important, and then save the second one for when you really need a negate. I think when I'm playing against a Baratheon deck, privileged position is one of the best cards I can get for intrigue. It's really good, and it goes without saying that the Baratheons have numerous ways of winning power challenges. They have a bunch of support for it. It's just what they do. I mean, we saw it didn't explicitly mention power challenges in that Shireen card we were looking at, but she only had a power icon, so she's meant to be used to help win power challenges. And what I've noticed about the power challenge support cards is that a lot of them don't necessarily reward you for winning power challenges. They just penalize you for losing them. And that is a subtle but very key distinction. I mean, Long May He Reign and Kings would both sack themselves if you lose a power challenge, but if you decide you don't want to declare one, your opponent has 1 crack at that per turn. Red Keep doesn't even sack itself, it just only kneels itself if you lose a power challenge. You don't have to win a power challenge to get off the ability of the Red Keep or to trigger privileged position. You just need to have not lost one yet. With Red Keep, it happens at the end of the challenges phase, so that's obviously not as busted because you can't use it during marshalling or something. But with this card, it's completely broken. For 1 cost, and that lacks a restriction, and if you're playing a Baratheon deck that is not super jank, like if it is at all parallel to any of the traditional Baratheon strategy, this card should be in there. Lastly, there's also a new card called Antler Men that I've noticed. Get 1 gold when a power is moved to your faction card. Now, Baratheons have a lot of ways to do that, but let's just assume that you're just a traditional, normal guy, and you do it by winning a power challenge and collecting claim. That would then give you 1 to soup up your privileged position. So if you want to give yourself the option, now that there's a new card that can give you a gold in the middle of the challenge phase, basically for winning a power challenge, that just makes 1 gold cost cards all the better, and this did not need souping up. This card is so good. Staple, negate, one of those cards that you should really be aware of in the meta. Next up, we have kind of an interesting card. It's Teeth Collector. It's 3 cost, only has intrigue, but has 3 strength. If you're a Monogon, typically, I would say your cost matches your strength, so that's fine. It's a the 7 card. Teeth Collector's ability actually does somewhat synergize with the 7 in terms of gaining power, but I don't think that you would make a Lannister 7 deck just to use this guy, but I don't know. He does have a general ability that's kind of interesting. A +1 gold modifier is always good, especially on a non-limited character, and there aren't really limited characters anywhere other than in Lannisters. Having a gold modifier in a card this cheap that's not limited is definitely not trivial. He definitely wants you to be getting gold because after you collect income, if you want to go down 2 gold for that turn, he can get a power. So I'm not sure how good this ability is early game, but Teeth Collector's always going to be good early game for the +1 off of paying 3. So that's good, but I think his ability starts to really get good when you start ramping, when you get to the point where the cards that you need are on the board, the cards your opponent needs are on their board, and you just need a little bit of extra power accelerant. And if you're a Lannister deck too, that gold can get a little bit out of control. I mean, they have insane econ abilities, so he just lets you turn that into power. He's a cool card. I'd like to see how he would be used in the 7 deck, but lastly, I will note you could try and make a ×3 Teeth Collector win condition deck because he is non-unique. Another amazing card coming up. I did not even realize how many good cards this pack had when I got it. Clever Feint. Now, this card alone is one of the main reasons, not the only one by a long shot, but one of the biggest ones why I would say that Lannister has the most, at least obvious, support for Shadow. You can also make arguments for Tyrell or Dorne, and I'm sure you can make arguments for niche other Baratheon or whatever. But I think when it comes to just directly supporting Shadow, Lannisters can do a lot of really important stuff, and this is one of the breads and butters. There are a lot of cards that like to come out of Shadow because then they can trigger their abilities. Within faction, you could do this with something like Sir Robert Strong. I mean, there are just a lot of cards whose relationship with their Shadow mechanic is just a one and done thing that happens when they come out of Shadow. This lets you retrigger that, and not a lot of things do. There's also cards if you're playing a Kingdom of Shadows deck. Oh boy, like once you step out of faction, you've got Castle Guard. This is an amazing card, and one amazing use for it is to return everything you have to Shadows and then just drop a Valor Morghulis or a board wipe or something. If you suspect your opponent is going to board wipe, or if you suspect you're about to board wipe, or if you want to, you can do this to... It doesn't save all your cards. You still have to pay their shadow costs, but that's usually cheaper than them dying. And if they were unique characters, they're just not dead. I mean, it's harder to touch things in shadow than it is to touch on the board. There's also, lastly, Varys, which is a really good shadow card who becomes cheaper the more cards you have in shadow. So after you use this, you've basically reduced the cost on him by 3 to come out of Shadow, which can kill something right away. This card has so many use cases. I'm not going to try and get into all of them, but if you really want to get creative with it, I mean, it's good in faction, but you're going to want to use Kingdom of Shadows because you want to use things like Aegon Targaryen or Jon Connington multiple times and just pull off these crazy Shadow nanigans. Shadow Nanigans, new term coining that. Ironborn coming in swinging hard with an axe with the 7-cost Loyal Victarion. Now, if I'm not mistaken, the only other version of Victarion is tied with one of the versions of Asha for being the most expensive at 6 cost of the non-loyal Ironborn pool. The only reason you would ever use that version is if you were playing a non-loyal Ironborn combo deck. If you're playing loyal Greyjoys and you're using a Victarion, you're using this one, and it's actually so good that it's been errated in a kind of weirdly worded way, but that's very simple. So let me start by talking about the actual original card. You can kneel a worship location to either kneel a location, stand Victarion, or give him renown, but only for 1 challenge. So basically, worships plus winning challenges translates into a power. Kneeling locations is very helpful. I mean, there's not a lot of ways to do that as liberally as this can. Standing him is super helpful because you can also give him renown. You are going to need to get a lot of worships, and the thing about worships is that a lot of them like to kneel themselves. Not all of them. Refurbished Hulk is really good for this purpose because that is strictly an econ initiative card that's really good in setup. I do love Refurbished Hulk. Kneeling it doesn't do anything. It doesn't have an ability to kneel itself. That applies a lot as well to a lot of worships that come out of shadows, like the Night's Watch one and Night Flyer. So worships that come out of shadows, normally pretty kneelable, and if you know you're not going to use your JT Drummond this turn, that's a neutral worship that you can kneel. You can always include in your deck. So it's easy to get cheap worships. There's, for example, the 0-cost Iron Fleet Scout, which is not even unique. You could play 3 of those in setup if you wanted to, or just if you draw it, you basically can just play it. Or you can just put that out. There are 0-cost warships. There's Scouting Vessel, of course. They do like to kneel themselves, but I'm just saying, if you'd rather use this ability, it's not hard to get a large amount of them on the board. They're the biggest supported location trait. It's just a fact. And this is the faction that supports them the most. You can use Euron to get silence, to get every warship, to get eager deckhands in play, and this guy is going to be the thing that sharpens it. You know, it's like polishing the blade with everything else, but this guy's the point at the end. This guy is so good, and I'll tell you how they eroded him. They worded it kind of weirdly, but it's the same as this ability right now, except you're only allowed to use the one where you stand him twice, which seems a little weird to me. I know that warship decks were I think pretty meta, but I don't know that much about them. I would assume that standing him twice, I guess for winning dominance. This guy is so good, and his ability, when I tell you how good it is, if you don't already know, should give you a real hint of how viable it is to just run 1 billion warships. Trillions of warships. Here's a warship right now, although it does make me eat my words about warships that come out of Shadow not really kneeling themselves. It has Shadow that's the same as its printed cost, which sucks because that means it goes from 2 to 4. But it does basically fishing net 2 of your opponent's characters. This lets you get unopposed challenges, which Greyjoy's like for a lot of reasons, but most notably their plot card, the Kraken's Grasp, I think. And its extra boost, if you decide to pay the extra 2 to outshadow it, is 2 characters instead of 1. Oh my. You do have to kneel this to do it, so that means that it sits there if you have Victorian as an option for him to use one of his abilities, but if you want to use its ability, you can't use it as Victorian fodder. You can use something like Clever Feint, which is not in faction, to try and put this back into Shadow, but elsewise, I'm not sure how you would do it. So this is not my favorite warship, because quite frankly, everyone knows that the coolest warships are the ones that belong to a specific character and give that character a buff, like Blackwind or Great Kraken. I don't even know what this is. I mean, it actually does look pretty sick, like some kind of ghost ship. Yeah, it's a warship. It made its point. It was the point I was making before. There's a lot of warships, okay? You can put a lot of them in your deck. Starting the Targaryens, we have Rhaegal. We have the Charmeleon-aged version of Rhaegal, who's not the little baby, 3 cost, I think, but he's not the big one with the sick artwork. What I think is funny is that they've obviously designated, because there are 3 dragons and 3 challenge icons, Drogon to be military, Rhaegal to be, they obviously all have military, but the intrigue one, and then Viserion has power. How does this have intrigue? This dragon is gonna outwit you somehow. I mean, for the most part, I feel like the intrigue, power, military trichotomy, while vague, is pretty well established, but this is just silly. But enough about that. He has ambush that's the same as his printing cost. That is awesome. And it has to do with the Targaryen support strategy of, killing your opponent's cards with card effects. I mean, it says right there, then you get to stand him. Most of the ways that do that reduce things strength to 0 and then kill them. So you reduce them 1 by 1 and then maybe use other events. And most of the dragons are immune to it. So he's good that he's a dragon. This is just the awkwardest version. I mean, 5 cost is a really awkward price. If you use Fire Made Flesh on the baby Rhaegal to do this, Fire Made Flesh costs 2, so that wouldn't even save you any money. Although it would be a search, you're obviously going to upgrade into the biggest one. I don't think this one's that great. It doesn't have a limit to the amount of times per phase its effect can be activated, unlike the new eroded Victorion. Is that really that good? I mean, its strength doesn't even match its cost. But that ambush thing is insane. Honestly, it doesn't even need an effect. Now that I think about it, the ambush thing is really insane. The only thing that I think stops this from being good, because it does match the synergy and standing yourself is good, even if it's kind of a little situational, is the fact that there are other better versions of Rhaegal that are more important and more proactively support the rest of your board. So I'm going to say no. Bad card. Worst version of Rhaegal. I think Rhaegal's the worst dragon. Can we agree? Intrigue? He thinks he's smarter than me. Next card is a card that I actually really like. It's basically a slightly more expensive in-faction version of the neutral 1-cost location Isle of Ravens. Isle of Ravens just kneels itself to take a card in the discard pile and shuffle it back into its owner's deck. This does the same thing, but it's 2 cost, it's a Targaryen loyal card, and it's a +1 gold modifier. First things first, let's acknowledge something that I love. Non-limited econ cards. If you get this in setup, you can play this along with other copies of itself or Bros Roads or whatever. Multiple econ cards. This starts you off ramping in setup with a +1 without having used your limited card. So I like that off the bat. Then its action is something that's very situational, but when it is important, it matters a lot. So you're not going to do this to put something in your deck, shuffle it, and hope you draw it again. That's ridiculous. Ways that it can counterpick your opponent are mainly if they have Annals of Castle Black. There's not a lot of ways to get stuff back from your discard pile, so for the most part, I would say, yeah, Annals of Castle Black is the only real reason you would use this on your opponent. If they've played like 3 events, they're probably running Annals of Castle Black, and you could start using this to once per turn get rid of their options. That could create problems for you if they have something like the Queen of Thorns that lets them search events, but in most cases, this is, so is Isle of Ravens, an annoying niche counter to Annals of Castle Black. But what it's really good for in faction is getting things back into your deck, not so that you can like draw into them again like some kind of Yu-Gi-Oh madman, but because you can use things like Fire Made Flesh to soup up baby dragons into bigger ones, but maybe they got one of the bigger ones with an intrigue challenge, so you shuffle it back in. What's interesting about this effect is it's one of those effects that it's not game changing, but every turn you're like, oh yeah, I have this, I guess I should use it. What's the best target to use it on? It's usually going to be something in your discard pile, but occasionally it'll be your opponent's. Overall, I like this card a lot. Non-limited econ cards are good, and I'm a big fan of Isle of Ravens just because if you can run it in your own deck, you should. Like if you have cards that search your entire deck, but even if you don't, it does have a chance to counterpick Annals of Castle Black, and this card really, it has the exact same function, but it also has the +1 gold, and I'm thumbs up on that. Starting good old Dorn, we have House Manwoody card, which holds the distinction, I believe to this day, I know of all the cards before the new cards, that is the only support card for the guard trait in the entire game. Isn't that something? The only guards I can think of in faction are both versions of Ario Hota, which are admittedly great. Southern Escort, I think. And Nymeria's guard, and then there's Palace Spearman, who I think this guy was designed to work with because Palace Spearman also has an ability that works if you're not the first player. Not kneeling when declared as a defender is cool because you're not the first player, so you'd like to be able to block and then still have your options left. It's just like, there's not enough. For you to fill your deck with guards on the off chance you draw this card would be nonsense because there are just other traits that could better support each other. You're not just going to ignore trades and just look at effects and try and make a strategy work. Trades are pretty important. This card is funny. It holds an interesting distinction, and honestly, if you have the right board, it's good. Like if you had this, 1 or 2 Palace Spearmen and maybe Ario Hota, then cool. Plus, you can ambush Ario Hota, and Southern Escort can come out of shadows, so I guess they don't have all the information. The guards are left and right amongst the factions, including the Tyrell cards left and right. You can make a combo deck, and then, I don't know, maybe this would be good. I don't know in what circumstance. This is a weird, funny card. Next Dornish card you want to talk about hilarious is this thing. They eroded this thing. Its effect is so nonsense that they eroded it beyond recognition. Like, I think this card and maybe Dornishman's Wife are the 2 cards that have been eroded that least resemble what they originally did. So let's talk about this card, which also, like, the characters on this are like Quentin, Archibald, Ironwood, and Jarris Drinkwater, like, you know, the boys, the lads. Did they consult the other art? Because as far as I know, like, this game's official art is pretty self-consistent. Who else would they be consulting? Let's talk about this jank effect, and then let's talk about how they changed it. I don't want to say fixed it, because that implies that they didn't just replace it with the new ability. It's a 4-cost total shadow event, and you get rid of all but the bottom card of your deck, shuffle your discard pile into your deck, and then draw 3. So right away, one thing that they were clearly going for with this is to combo with Dorn, which is weird because it's called a mission in Essos, which is not where Dorn is, but the card Dorn lets you pick one of 2 cards and put one of them on the bottom of your deck. Same with, I think, Greenblood Trader, and, you know, same with, like, Valor, Dohyrus and stuff. So they want you to obviously do something sick with this, where I guess you pull out the win by, like, calculating that you have exactly, I don't know, like, 2 cards in your discard pile, you'll get rid of it, you'll draw into the bottom card that you just put there. This card, maybe it's busted. I don't know if it's like unplayably good and that's why they eroded it, or just unplayably bad, but I don't know why it would have the audacity to cost this much. I am interested to see what a deck that used this would look like, where you would be turboing into your discard pile, but then getting rid of your deck. That doesn't really matter because your opponent is not going to be trying to deck you out as a win condition. That's just never going to happen. While you're doing all this nonsense of shuffling shit into your discard pile so you can have a better deck than the stuff that you were getting into your discard pile from your hand to make your deck better, which is questionable prioritization in the first place, your opponent's going to be winning. And then, ooh, you use this, now you got a better deck. The big thing is the +3 on the draw. I mean, that's good. It's still pretty pricey, and considering that if you use it at the wrong time, you're just going to lose the game. I don't know what they were thinking with this, and I honestly don't know, but why they had to errata it. Like, was it banned? Like, I'm not saying they shouldn't have. I'm just saying, like, was it banned because it was really good, or because there was just no reason to use it? And it just makes me chuckle to think about them, you know, the conclave, trying to figure out how to keep the spirit of this card and still errata it to make it playable, and then them just going, fuck it. Now what it does is, I think it's 0 cost shadow, and then you get rid of a Martell character that you have, and then you search your deck for a character with lower printing cost but the same trait, put it into play. Mainly useful for Sand Snakes, which, you know, is kind of just a weaker trait overall than Bastards, and Lords as well, or Ladies, which are both strategies that Martells can use. They use a Tears of Lease or something, one of those targeted removals that doesn't happen until the end of the challenges phase. You can swap them out. It's kind of like a little in-faction Skagos, but with traits instead of the same name. It's cool. It's a cool way to like switch between Sand Snakes, and it has a lot of flexibility no matter what Dornish deck you're running. It's a pretty splashable shadow card, and it did it a lot of favors to make the shadow cost 0. But yeah, don't ask me, guys. Don't know what they were thinking with this original one. I'm glad someone addressed the elephant in the room and changed it, but like, what is this about? All right, it's time for the neutral cards, and we're starting off with 1/1, one of 2 giants in the game, which are now supported by the new amazing Night's Watch card, Leathers. What Leathers does is give every wildling character of the Night's Watch affiliation and every giant character an intrigue icon. So you might notice that 1/1 right away doesn't have any icons, even though you just spent 6 gold on him, and he has 11 strength, and you're like, man, I really wish he had an icon. You could give him an intrigue icon. Kind of funny that's the icon he would have, but sure. However, he can pseudo have an icon by participating in whatever challenge you want him to. You can just tap him whenever anyone would do a challenge, and he joins. So in all honesty, he has kind of all the icons as long as he's not alone in a challenge and you're using a wildling. He would obviously go in a wildling deck. And now that there is giant support, if you're running it, since he's one of only 2 giants, you would definitely use him. He's a pretty good wildling. He can have attachments, but none except weapons, so you can't swear him to the watch, which is annoying. But like I said, Leathers and also the 6 cost version of the wall can make him Night's Watch if you want to make a Night's Watch wildling deck to use the tiny bit of support between them, basically Jon Snow. But it's not super necessary. A very solid card if you can get him on the board. However, I think he's ironically not that great of a target for Last of the Giants, especially compared to the other giant, Mag the Mighty. He can't do as much in one turn before he dies, and that's always unfortunate for these high-cost neutral cards. This guy is a giant. He's one of the 2 cards that card literally talks about in its title, and in my opinion, no, but it would be a funny surprise. And your opponent would be like, oh, that's funny, you use Last of the Giants and he's a giant. Okay, this pack has turned out to be really good, but here's the reason I got it. Poisoned Coin. Amazing. I talked about it a lot in a previous video where I talked about Pinch of Powder, but it's a 0 cost shadow event, so this thing only costs you 2 overall, and even if you have no gold left, if you have a card in shadow, your opponent has to worry about this. When you win an unopposed challenge with a character with shadow, you can Tears of Lease, basically put a death token on something that doesn't have shadow, and then it dies at the end of the turn. For 0 gold, that's really good. Just considering the basic fact that towards the end of the game was when the shadow mechanic was introduced, by its nature, a smaller percentage of cards are shadow than not shadow. That wouldn't matter to you because you won't run this card if you don't want to run shadow cards, but if you know that you're using shadow cards and you can trigger it, it's just on a basic level, more likely that any of your opponent's characters wouldn't have Shadow. Honestly, most of their aces don't, unless they're playing a Shadow deck like you are, in which case this card might be a dud for you both. But this is something you really need to be aware of in the meta because it's 0 cost. Like, your opponent, if they have any cards in Shadow, and they have cards that have Shadow, you cannot let them get an unopposed challenge. You can't do it, no matter what. Even if you don't think they have Poison Coin, even if there are 2 Poison Coins in their discard pile, if there's the possibility of one, it can be so devastating, and it's 0 gold. You have to be aware of that and Pinch of Powder. Those are the big Shadow removal options. Shadow is kind of a confusing mechanic, I feel like, for a lot of people, and it is weird because it creates a space where cards can be and a situation they can be in that's different from everything else in the rest of the game. So a lot of people are weirded out when they're playing against a Shadow deck, but just I beseech you, keep in mind Poison Coin and Pinch of Powder. This agenda is the funniest agenda to me, and they eroded it, which I understand why, but still. Your plot deck and draw deck can only include neutral cards. Now, this is the original version of it, and how funny of a deck building restriction is that? I mean, you still have to pick a faction card. That's not optional, but there is no difference between what faction you pick and what faction you don't, other than that it's going to confuse you when you're trying to look through your decks to get ready to play someone. This is so funny. It's just a statement. It's just forcing you to look inward and say, what's my favorite faction? If I had to pick a faction and it would provide nothing for my deck, what would I pick? That's hilarious. Then what does it actually do after claim is applied for a challenge where you're attacking with a wildling? You can kneel your faction cards, which is not only does it have the audacity to have not just a deck building restriction, but I think probably the most severe deck building restriction in the game, unless you want to count the long voyage. It's a faction kneeler, so even with all these neutral cards, you can't be reliably using like Shadow Black Lane or like Streets of Silk. That doesn't seem that strong of an ability to me to apply claim of. I mean, it's cool. It's definitely cool. I don't know how I would necessarily use that to a huge advantage, especially because like wildlings, there are a good amount of them, but they're kind of pricey, and a lot of neutral cards aren't wildlings, and there's no way to make something a wildling. So overall, that is an insane deck building restriction. It's a faction kneeler, which means A, you can't run other faction kneelers, so it's also kind of a bonus deck building restriction on top of all that, and you can only do it once per turn. It only applies to a specific subset of traits of cards that you're allowed access to. So you could consider that just a cherry on top of a deck building restriction. I guess it does allow you to do 2 of the same challenge, which is kind of cool, especially if you can increase claim. I mean, I don't have a pure wildling deck, but the new version of this has also allowed you to include non-loyal wildling characters from any faction. Like, whatever. I mean, who cares? This is my Free Folk, this original one, because it's so funny. I haven't really tried my Night's Watch wildling deck. It's kind of half and half. It's also kind of a Rangers deck. But I have noticed, a little tip I can give is that the agenda Aloof and Apart is pretty good for a wildling deck because they're expensive. A lot of them are 6 or higher. Like, it's kind of awkward to play. But yes, since I don't have a deck with this agenda, I will not say anything more than that. And finally, we have our lone plot card, Winter Reserves. I really like this card. It's 5 gold, which is exactly perfect. That's enough for me. It's a winter plot card. It's a kingdom plot card. And this is the kind of only in plot deck support for the plot deck archetype Winter, which is a fairly small pool of cards in the plot deck for how supported it is, especially in Starks. There's a couple in Night's Watch, and then of course there is one of the first agendas released, Kings of Winter, which has not aged well, but it's aged better than Kings of Summer, I would think. And this card is really kind of a staple opener if you're using a winter deck. Now, it is a kingdom card, so if your opponent uses naval superiority, then you can get fucked over by it. If they see from your setup that you're likely running a winter build, they might suspect you're going to run this and hard read a naval superiority to turn your gold to 0 on the first turn. However, they would then have 2 gold. Who's running naval superiority that's not using it with that Prince Duran's Behest? I genuinely don't know. So I wouldn't really worry about that. I would worry about the initiative a little bit, but just increasing the gold value is obviously amazing, a reverse loan from the Iron Bank. But the reserve value is not as trivial as you would think, because a big downside of winter block cards is that a lot of them have low reserve. Like Early Frost is a card that reduces the amount of cards you draw. Its reserve is 4. I love that card. It also has Claim 2. That's one of the best winter block cards. That card is slept on. I think Famine also has 4. A lot of the ones that have 2 Claim have reserve 4, but most of them don't have higher than 5. This helps you out. It makes them have a more reasonable reserve, like to match the average reserves of the game. You know, I just realized that I said reserves like 50 times about winter cards, and it's called winter reserves. So no shit. It's good. It's one of the few cards in this game that I think is like a clear opener for a lot of decks. Now, there was At the Gates for every deck until that got banned, and that being a Kingdom card didn't stop it from being OP. So Naval Superiority really just, it's not quite nailing it. But yeah, this one's good. If you're running a winter deck, which, you know, may or may not use the agenda, feel free not to. It's not that good, but it's kind of fun. The agenda reduces your opponent's reserve and yours, so this would counteract that. So if you're using this, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to use the agenda, but if you're using the agenda, I would use this. Another pack opening complete, and I have a few more on the way, so I will see you guys soon.